Let's break down 7 players that are set to absolutely go off in week 7 of 2024 fantasy football. These are players that you can absolutely not bench this week because their upside is way too high. Their matchups are way too good. And ultimately, these players are going to help you dominate your league mates here in week 11. All right, let's start the video off with George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who's had 11.4 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts since Russell Wilson has become the starting quarterback for the Steelers. If you guys remember earlier in the season, I really encourage you guys that did own George Pickens to hold out some faith here, and I encourage you guys to buy low on George Pickens as well. But quite frankly, I expected George Pickens to start potentially going off after the bye week because the schedule is so strong for the wide receiver position. But he's been going off since week 7, and we look ahead over the next couple weeks. Baltimore, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Philly a little tough, then Baltimore again, then a not-so-great matchup against Kansas City in week 17. But ultimately, that is a handful of prime matchups for George Pickens, and it starts this week against the Baltimore Ravens, who are allowing the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position thus far on the season. Pickens averaging 12.6 fantasy points per game, solid floor, but that ceiling has been elevated for the most part with Russell Wilson as a starting quarterback. But don't forget, in week 8, even when he only had 11.4 fantasy points, he had 2 touchdowns called back in that game. Pickens is the wide receiver 3 in fantasy football since week 7. And he missed a game in week 9. He's been absolutely balling out. There's no reason whatsoever to bench him this week. This matchup is way too good. This Baltimore Ravens defense, their secondary is banged up. Their secondary is complete Swiss cheese. They are allowing massive games to the wide receiver position, and George Pickens is going to absolutely go off here in week 11. Make sure you do not bench him. And I am absolutely heading to Underdog to smash the over on George Pickens receiving yards this week, sitting at 66.5 receiving yards. This is an absolute steal. He has hit this line in 3 straight games, and now he's facing the worst secondary in the NFL. This feels like a free pick 'em. And by the way, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code The Catch, that link is down below, are getting a free pick 'em from Underdog for week 11. Take your free pick 'em, pair it with Pickens receiving yards. Once both of those hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, all new users who sign up on Underdog with that promo code The Catch are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Let's move along and take a look at Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans, who's been absolutely balling out in the absence of DeAndre Hopkins since he was traded to the Chiefs. 12.3 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts, all without DeAndre Hopkins. 8 or more targets in each of those games. And the most encouraging thing from this past week, although he scored a garbage time touchdown, all that stuff. But the encouraging thing from that 25.4 fantasy day, was the fact that Will Levis was the starting quarterback, and it didn't matter because those games in weeks 8 and 9, we saw Mason Rudolph, and the switch at quarterback did not impact Calvin Ridley. Now, this is still a tough Minnesota Vikings defense, and they put together some very good game plans, and they might chalk up a good game plan against Will Levis, don't get me wrong, but the secondary is still the weakest part of this defense easily, and they're giving up the 30th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So Ridley's been on an absolute tear. He's averaging 11.7 fantasy points per game, and he's had some really bad games on the season. So the fact that he's still averaging double digits is encouraging, and all we really want to look at is what he's done since DeAndre Hopkins has been traded, and he's moved into a true wide receiver 1 role with the Titans. Plus, we know this Titans team, It's just not very good in general. They're going to be playing from behind. The game script benefits Calvin Ridley because they have to consistently go to passing the football. So Ridley's been great over the past couple weeks, coming off of his best fantasy day on the season. I'm expecting another solid fantasy outing from Calvin Ridley here in week 11. Make sure he is in your starting lineups. Moving along, let's take a look at Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. And in the start sit video, I had Cedric Tillman as a strong flex option, and the Cedric Tillman truthers came out. I hear you guys. I do. He's been fantastic over the past couple weeks. 18.1 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. It's been absolutely fantastic with an average of 28.9 fantasy points, only averaging 7.8 fantasy points on the season. Well, that's because he didn't really get involved until we saw Amari Cooper traded, right? But the past 3 starts have been absolutely fantastic. Now we have the Browns coming out of a bye week, traveling to face the New Orleans Saints secondary that's allowing the 26th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. The only things that make me in any way shaky about Tillman is the fact that we're still seeing volume to 3 other players. That's Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, and David Njoku. On top of that, I don't really trust Jameis Winston at the quarterback position. I just don't. But to be fair, we didn't see a good game out of Jameis Winston in the Browns' last game in Week 9, 3 interceptions, just 1 passing touchdown, 230 passing yards. But the 1 passing touchdown went to Cedric Tillman. So even if the Browns don't have a great day offensively, I still think Tillman is the wide receiver to start out of the Browns bunch, which is what I said in the start set video. But there is some risk involved here, I think. But then when we really kind of scale it back, the fact that he's had 18.1 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, and he's facing this Saints secondary that is not intimidating whatsoever, does make him a must-start player this week, a very strong flex option with lots of upside. If you own Cedric Tillman, here you go. I would completely start him in Week 11. I think he is set to go absolutely nuclear once again. All right, one wide receiver that I heavily encourage you guys to start in Week 10 was Jauan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers, who had 16.3 fantasy points against that Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary that has been allowing big days to the wide receiver position. 11 targets, 7 catches, 93 receiving yards, playing in that X role that we typically have seen Brandon Ayuk play in on the season. What we saw Debo do Debo things, and Ricky Pearsall play out of the slot and plenty of volume to George Kittle. And here we go, going into Week 11, we have another injury to a San Francisco 49er. It doesn't seem to be serious, but we do have George Kittle on the injury report. Jennings off the injury report, CMC back. This is just how this team operates, but nonetheless, we should see another game where we see plenty of volume to Jauan Jennings in a good matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, allowing the 23rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. The reason that I bring up Kittle is because, well, we still have a lot of volume going around here. This past week, 7 targets to CMC, 6 targets to Ricky Pearsall, 6 to Debo, just 4 to Kittle, but he did have a touchdown, and Brock Purdy has really been looking to Kittle's direction in the end zone. Nonetheless, all of those targets, majority of the targets, went to Jauan Jennings, with him being the only player on this team with double-digit volume in terms of targets. So I don't really particularly think that that'll change this week. Brock Purdy really seems to want to rely on his ex-wide receiver and have them heavily involved. And we've heard Kyle Shanahan come out and say that this is the role that Jennings is going to play for the rest of the season. And I really think that this offense can operate very well this way. And on top of that, Brock Purdy has been fantastic on this season, not getting nearly as much love as he should be getting, and he's a must-start quarterback this week, going into Week 11 as a QB8 in fantasy football with 20 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. But if you own Jauan Jennings, I mean, all of last week, I felt like I was consistently talking about Jauan Jennings, telling you guys if he is still out there on the waiver, make sure you pick him up. If you have him right now, you have to start him in week 11. He's going to have a very safe floor, and he has the possibility of a very high ceiling here in week 11. Okay, last wide receiver I want to mention is Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, coming in as the wide receiver 15 so far on the season, averaging 12 fantasy points per game. He's been fantastic over the last 3 weeks, 17 or more fantasy points in every game. Since week 6, 15 or more fantasy points in every game but 1. Since week 4, 15 or more fantasy points in every game but 2. So overall, Sutton, I think a very strong start against a weak Atlanta Falcons secondary, giving up the 25th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They're really allowing for good overall game scripts. And this is a home game for the Broncos. This is a tough place to travel, so I really think that overall we could see a nice game out of the Denver Broncos passing attack, which has not been that bad. We talked about Bo Nix a lot on the channel earlier than I think some other people were talking about Bo Nix, and he's been great coming off of a very clean game against the Kansas City Chiefs. No turnovers, 22 of 30, 215 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. We know that Sutton is the true wide receiver 1 on this team. No doubt about it. He's going to get all of the volume here, 9 or more targets in 3 straight games. It's a great matchup. If you own Courtland Sutton, don't overthink this one. He's a very strong wide receiver 2. He's a very strong flex. And overall, he should be in our starting lineups and remain in our starting lineups moving forward, but especially here in week 11 in a great matchup. Next up is David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions, moving to the running back position here. And there seems to be some concern for some reason about Monty, I suppose because he's had 12.6 fantasy points in 2 straight games, and he hasn't broken into 20 fantasy points since week 6. But Monty is still the RB11 thus far on the season, averaging 15.4 fantasy points. I know we're seeing, plenty of volume to Gibbs. For example, in week 10 against Houston, let's see, 12 touches to Monty, 2 targets. And then for Gibbs, on the other hand, 19 touches and 3 targets. But still, it's close to an even split here, and I'm not concerned about this. But what I do love this week is that this is a home game against the Jacksonville Jaguars, one of the worst defenses overall in the entire NFL, and awful against the run, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the running back position. And this feels like one of those games where the Lions could get up early and stay up on this Jaguars team, although it's handed to the Jaguars. They surprised us a bit last week against Minnesota, but nonetheless, I don't quite think that's going to happen this week. And this is going to be one of those games that I feel like they're going to have Monty close this thing out, get a lot of volume, ground and pound type game. And I think we see Monty break back into that 18, 20 point type range of fantasy points, score 1 or more touchdowns in this game. I mean, he had a touchdown this past week and only had 10 fantasy points, but I'm not worried about that. I think he's going to bounce back here in a big way, give us a high ceiling performance, be a huge part of the game plan. If you own Monty, once again, this is a top 12 running back on the season, averaging double-digit fantasy points on the season per game. Don't overthink this one. It's a smash matchup. If you own Monty, he needs to stay in your starting lineups here in week 11. All right, last player I want to mention is Kareem Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, been a lot of hysteria around Kareem Hunt as of late because we know Isaiah Pacheco is back and practicing in a limited capacity, but we also have the news that Pacheco is not going to play here in week 11 on the road against the Buffalo Bills in what is probably the toughest matchup the Chiefs have had all season long, maybe outside of week 1 against Baltimore. So we know this is a big game. We know it's always a good game when these two teams meet. I'm expecting a good game script. I'm expecting points in this game. But one of the best matchups in this game will be Kareem Hunt against a Buffalo Bills defense that's allowing the 31st most fantasy points to the running back position. The Bills have been very good against the pass on the season. They have not been very good against the run so far on the season. So this is a smash matchup for Kareem Hunt. This might be his last hurrah, at least until you is maybe splitting time with Pacheco. I don't know that they're going to just hand over all the volume to Pacheco right away. And we do see the Chiefs play the Carolina Panthers in Week 12, so they will be running the football quite a bit either way in Week 12. Nonetheless, Hunt has been great in the absence of Pacheco, averaging 16.8 fantasy points per game. He's the RB28 so far on the season, didn't play the first 3 games of the year. Double digits every single game so far on the season. 17 or more fantasy points in 4 out of those 6 games, coming off of a game this past week where he wasn't great against or on the ground against the Denver Broncos, but he got really involved in the passing game with 10 targets and 7 grabs. He's going to be involved one way or another. Been absolutely fantastic in that stretch with 5 total touchdowns. So if you own Hunt, don't overthink it. Nothing to worry about in terms of Pacheco yet. Here in Week 11, Kareem Hunt is set to go absolutely nuclear. This is a matchup we absolutely cannot ignore. That'll do it for today's video. There are 7 players set to go absolutely nuclear. Here in Week 11, there are your must starts of the week. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever as we move into Week 11, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because as the week progresses and from the beginning of the week, we're going to have everything you could possibly need to help you dominate Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.